So can't you pull that off your whole your congressman and senators?
I've spent more time on the phone with Bob Latta's office in the last week
No one's sitting on
I've spent my 5 years.
That wouldn't be
Just
fun.
find me, I put somebody.
I wouldn't say 1 second of it has been any fun.
Oh, there we go.
He's just not a fun guy, I don't think.
Well, I haven't talked to him,
Okay.
just his
Just
people.
his people.
Just excuses. I always like that. You give this and then they give an excuse why not. Then you give this and it's an excuse why not. I get tired of excuses.
This way, 27.
It's pretty apparent that most of the
Okay.
spending will go to the big
We are
cities.
live.
Joe, when's the lilac festival? Next weekend?
Next weekend.
Saturday.
Is it the 10th?
The first? Okay.
So we're scheduled to have rain.
Saturday, it's a Saturday.
Just make sure I understand this.
Never seen one. Well, maybe I could work like that.
All right, we're underway in about a minute.
$22 days left.
Till Christmas?
No, school,
Are those school days or calendar days?
school days.
That's a good thing. First day of school, I counted.
And they're all ready.
I
You don't miss
counted
those
them.
days.
I do not miss those. But I used to count the very first day. I only have this many more,
This
this
is
many
gonna
more.
be nice because there's no field trip.
That's sad, isn't it?
Not really. Yeah, you have an easy out this school.
I did it when I was in
Man.
school, so
Yeah,
I
I would
would
not
not
financially burdened, but.
Kids would ask me.
Plus, do you have field days or like outside days?
for Christmas.
No, I'm guessing there probably is.
Kids are ready. Adele said, they're shutting down.
No tin
I
cats,
said,
no.
yep.
Oh,
Zoo.
yeah, that's a
As soon
bummer.
as
No
prom
village,
hits,
Sutter
they'll
village.
shut down.
All right.
Still closed.
We're underway in
First,
10,
when the
No,
state
they're
testing
trying
is
to
Tuesday.
9,
But zoo's not closed anymore.
No, I don't think so. I think it's still open.
6. Good evening and welcome to the Defiance City Council meeting for tonight, April 27th, 2021. Before we get underway, let's bow our heads in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the break in the weather. We thank you for the sunshine and spring. It is rejuvenating to us. We also ask that you would rejuvenate our minds and our bodies this evening as we consider the city of Defiance and the people that live there. Lord, please give us wisdom and insight into how we can properly manage and steward the city that is trusting us to make decisions. We ask that you be present this evening, that our words and our actions and our attitudes strengthen and encourage each other. In Jesus' name, amen. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Let the record show that all the members of council are present. Would you stand with me for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I've reviewed the index minutes for 2 city council meetings, the one of April 6th and the one for April 13th. Do we have a motion to amend or correct either one of these index minutes? Without any, I will approve them. Do we have any liaison meeting requests or reports? Without any, do we have any comments from council? Mr. Waxler?
Yeah, I was gonna ask, we're putting all that money into Bronson Ring. Where are we at with that sidewalk out there? Last time we talked about Safe to School grant or something.
Are you talking about the
The South Clinton Street sidewalk.
we did not get a Safe Routes to School grant on the sidewalk. They denied it. What we're going to do is we've had several discussions in Board of Control about that site, and that continues to be something that we continue to look at. I think that there's been some discussions about just exactly who should pay for that sidewalk. Should it be a property owner's responsibility? Should it be something that's shared by the city? And we recognize the fact that we need a sidewalk there. But in terms of actually doing something in the 2021 budget, it's not budgeted, and I got to tell you, it continues to get our attention and discussion on it. So we've had things where our discussion has gone, would we pay 50% of that, and maybe the property owner share in that responsibility? So it continues to be on our radar screen, and we continue to, we want to move forward with it.
Are we getting more money from the state, from the government? Is that something we can look at using some of that money for, since it is?
Well, we are going to get CARES Act money, and Mr. Leonard might want to talk about it, and we actually have been in meetings to plan for that as far as what sort of projects would come to the forefront on that. Part of that dialogue has been just talking in terms of where can we get a return on our investment if we have this much money coming in. And as we haven't actually seen anything in terms of proper notification that this is what you're going to get. I think that's probably going to come down the road. But I can tell you that the planning for that is still going on, and we've talked about issues like that. We talked about issues of trying to build in where we can get like a multiplier effect of the use of the money, where most citizens in the community can enjoy it. And I think that if we're going to dedicate money elsewhere, like for that sidewalk, I think we would certainly bring that to city council and have a discussion about that before we move forward with any of the money that's going to be coming into the city.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we've been talking about for years, and I think if we got the money, we should be, something we really need to consider looking at. It's gonna be well spent money in my eyes. It's gonna be safer,
We have money coming. First indications are it's about $3.2 million. That number remains to be seen. There's still formula tweaks that are going on. I'm not sure when we'll get it. I'm not sure we'll get it all at once or over a couple of year period of time. And then the rules on how the money can be used are still being finalized. So as soon as we have all that information, and as Jeff had said, we've talked about various capital projects, and that sidewalk is certainly on the list.
And I had one more thing. Did you ever decide on any signage or anything out there at the dog park at the crossing? A sign or whatever?
Obviously, I don't think we're going to hashtag it in terms of like.
You was just gonna put like a pedestrian crossing sign or something up out there?
No, I can follow up with the engineer on that, Steve.
I think they had to order a sign, Mr. Waxley.
I'm sorry?
I think they had to order a sign.
Okay.
And
Because I know you was talking about putting some up selling them, there's more parking out back and stuff too, so.
Thank you. Mr. Resty.
Hey Jeff, have you, when you finally get an idea of how much money the city's gonna get from the CARES Act, potential monies that we can possibly use elsewhere, again, following up on what Mr. Waxler was saying, do we have an idea of what it would cost to redo the sidewalk on South Clinton Street?
$400,000. $400,000.
Okay.
And that's moving it back away and everything.
Yeah, that would. And the engineer calculates it out per lineal foot. So I think estimations are around that.
Thank you. Do we have any other comments from council? No? If not, there's two items on my desk. One is just a reminder that pursuant to Rule 12.3, Next Tuesday, which is May 4th, we'll have a study session. It's a presentation from DHS CAD on the roundabout improvements, but it will be right at the front of our city council meeting. And secondly, just a general statement that all permits to sell alcoholic beverages will expire on July 1st, 2021. You want to make sure if you have one, you need to get your permit filed and postmarked no later than June 2nd. And that's all I have. Mayor McCann.
Thank you, President McMaster. I did want to share with council, I know we sent you an email a couple weeks ago that the Purple Heart Bridge was recognized. The correct term is New Short Span Bridge Award. And this is the actual award. It's kind of nice. The credit goes out to a lot of people. Mr. Leonard for making the money side work out. Linda Sproul, Nikki Warnicki, Kirsty Mack, and some of the enhancements that we did to the bridge that I'm sure contributed to receiving this award, and all the folks that live here that put up with the inconvenience of having to go around for 9 months or so. Good job by all. That's all I have, sir.
That's it. Mr. Leonard.
Just one expenditure to report to council. We do have an expenditure of $18,998 to Michigan Pipe and Valve Incorporated. This was for a water main break that we had at South Clinton Street in Dottier. That was a pretty big break, and we were short on supplies and had to go out and make sure that we purchased additional supplies from this company. So that's all I have.
Thank you. Mr. O'Donnell.
I'd like to request an executive session for a conference with an attorney for the public body concerning a dispute involving the body that is subject of imminent court action. That's Ohio Revised Code Section 121.22 G3.
All right. Mr. O'Donnell requested an executive session this evening. Do you have a motion? Mr. Waxler?
Second.
Second. Mr. Hancock?
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
And Mrs. Crutch? Yes.
Excellent. Okay, before we adjourn this evening, executive session.
Thank you. That's all I have.
That's it? Okay. And Mr. Leonard?
I have nothing tonight.
All right. All right, we have 4 items for discussion this evening. Ms. Elders, would you read the caption for the first?
First reading by caption, only an ordinance reciting the suspension of rules of conduct and procedure of the Defiance City Council and declaring an emergency.
Mr. O'Donnell.
Thank you, Mr. President. The ordinance before you is an attempt to capture your will as legislative authority for the city through the motion that you passed on the 13th of April. But it's also the intent to comply with the current safety regulations, precautions, and guidelines from the Ohio Department of Health. On April 7th, 2020, this body met and suspended about 10 rules that permitted the public to attend and participate in these discussions. At the time, we only needed 15 days to slow the spread of the virus. So on April 13th this year, you directed me to draft legislation that would both allow the public back into the meetings, but also comply with the latest Ohio Department of Health orders. Those latest orders came in on April 8th, 2021. My recommendation to you is to pass an ordinance like the one before you without like specific texts and specific restrictions that you might find in the order, only because the orders are subject to change. And just an example, just today, the CDC changed the outdoor mask requirements. You no longer have to wear a mask outside while you're mountain biking, so that's a good thing. But presently, the director of the Ohio Department of Health says that the masks are still required indoors, and then the room can only be allowed to reach 25% of capacity, which is about 10 people, give or take. Everyone else, probably first come, first serve. Everyone else probably has to wait outside to make their points or ask their questions. The attendees should sit 6 feet apart, and then all doors and windows should be open to ensure proper ventilation. These are, of course, subject to change. And so my recommendation to you is to fulfill your motion to restore access to the public while maintaining the Ohio Department of Health guidelines.
Thank you. Do we have any questions for Mr. O'Donnell?
No further questions, most spending call.
We have no questions.
Second.
We have a motion to suspend and call Mr. Waxler. Second, Mr. Corbett.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Math?
Yes.
Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
We have a motion to adopt.
Do
Motion to adopt. Second, Mr. Rusty.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Math?
Yes.
Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
And Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
And this ordinance is adopted.
First reading by caption only, an ordinance authorizing the purchase of a replacement Herco valve exerciser machine and declare an emergency.
Mr. Leonard?
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. This ordinance actually is kind of interesting to me because some 10 or 12 years ago, the city applied for a grant through the Bureau of Workers' Comp, and the whole point of the grant was to purchase a machine such as this because we were having many cases where workers were wrenching their back on trying to turn valves in just manually. BWC actually promoted a program where this particular piece of equipment, which is the Herco valve exerciser, actually applies that pressure without human physical labor. And we've actually used it, and I can tell you that we don't have guys slipping as they're trying to turn these valves and opening these or closing these valves, and it's been a success. Today, that machine has used its useful life. We still have attachments that we can use with this particular machine that we're using. And what we're asking council to do is approve a new valve exerciser machine. We'll use the old attachments with it, and we'll continue to use hydraulics to open valves instead of physical human labor on it, because we've seen too many cases where some of our claims were up and it was identified as actually opening and closing valves. So mostly opening them because you have to put a lot of wrenching on it. So we're asking council tonight to approve this, and at an expenditure of $64,000. The prior one 10 years ago was around $41,000. That grant was around $30,000, as I remember it. And there is no grant attached to this particular one today. So we're asking council to approve this piece of legislation so we can purchase that equipment.
What do we do with our old one, or what's wrong with the old one, Jim?
It's worn out. It just won't function anymore.
We use it that often?
Yeah.
Any other questions, Mr.
Is there
Hancock?
a salvage value for the old one?
If there is, we'll take it to OmniSource and scrap it out. We'll keep the attachments and use the old attachments for this piece of new machinery. We can do
So they're
that.
interchangeable.
Yeah.
And we've already had this in our budget for this year.
This was budgeted.
Any other questions? Mr. Mast?
Just to clarify, this particular machine, it's not a one-trick pony, correct? It's got
It's got other features.
multiple
Yeah.
uses.
You can actually use it on hydrants, and I think as DJ described it, you can use it within hydrants to kind of pull the guts out of a hydrant for usage like that. It has multiple options to it that you can use it for. It's not just a valve turner. It can do other things for you as well.
No further questions, motion to suspend the call.
Mrs. Crutch has made a motion to suspend and call. Mr. Corbett, a second.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Wexler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
And
Motion adopt.
motion to adopt, Mr. Engel.
Second.
Second, Mr. Mast.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Wexler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
And Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
This ordinance is also adopted.
First reading by caption only, an ordinance accepting a donation of real estate at 150 Domerville Road.
Mr. O'Donnell.
Thank you. The Midwest Community Federal Credit Union currently owns the site of one of our sewer pump stations at 150 Domersville Road. That's right at the light there as you're coming out on Deerwood. They are actually conveying the building to the parcel with the building on it to another government entity adjacent to where we're talking about. And they wish to donate this parcel to the city because we have the infrastructure already on it. And the cleanest way for us to do that is to enter into a purchase agreement for $1 that complies with our ordinances, the treasury regulations for the donor. So that's my recommendation. And then you as council obviously have control anyway over which property we acquire or sell. So this ordinance authorizes that transaction, including attorney's fees, the closing costs, the owner's insurance policy for title insurance, and any other fees associated with closing.
Thank you. Do we have any questions for Mr. O'Donnell?
No further question. We'll suspend the call.
Second.
We have no other questions. A motion, Mr. Waxler. Second, Mr. Mast.
Mr. Wexler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
And Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Motion adopt.
Motion to adopt, Mr. Hancock.
Second.
Second, Mrs. Crutch.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
And Mr. Wexler?
Yes.
This ordinance is also adopted.
First reading by caption only, an ordinance authorizing a contract for the construction of a multi-use path on Ottawa Avenue and declare an emergency.
Mr. O'Donnell.
This body agreed to set as a priority in correlation with the Ottawa Avenue, Cleveland Avenue roundabout project, a pedestrian connection from that intersection down to Greenbrier Lane, which leads into the Spring Meadows neighborhood. You approved the design contract for this shared use path last February of 2020, excuse me. Yeah, that design is complete. The city engineer has opened bids for constructing this path on April 6th, and Ward Construction Company out of Lipsick had the lowest and best bid at $233,881. The estimate of probable cost that was budgeted was $280,000. And so your approval authorizes Mr. Leonard to enter into the contract for the $233,881 with Ward Construction Company as the successful bidder.
Thank you. Mr. Leonard.
Just to note that there's also $147,000 in grant funding from the state that goes towards this project in that dollar amount.
Thank you. Mrs. Crutch.
With this project, are they gonna have a multi-use path sidewalk from the railroad out to the roundabout and then it goes on out to Spring Meadows?
Well, I mentioned to you before the meeting started that I've spent a fair amount of time the last week with Congressman Latta's office. That was one of the things that we discussed in this new infrastructure bill. I'll also say I discussed with them the South Clinton Street sidewalk that we spoke about earlier. So they're aware of it. I'm not hopeful that something will come of that. There are plans in the works for the multi-use path to be extended, not only Mrs. Crutch to the CSX railroad tracks, but all the way out to East 2nd Street. So at least to Citizens Bank, they have new sidewalks. But again, we thought with everything we were hearing and reading and receiving from the various groups that we receive information from, the construction of these pedestrian walkways seemed like a great fit. But in talking to the congressman's people, apparently it's not, sadly. But stay tuned. We'll see how things go. We actually were also going to appeal to Senator Sherrod Brown's staff as well. His liaison is always pretty responsive. Erica Kraus is her name, and Erica's really good about working on our behalf. So we'll see how it develops. That's kind of a long answer. I apologize.
That's fine. I'd like to see a sidewalk for these people up there.
Yep.
That's the big deal.
Any other questions in these regards?
No other question or discussion, motion suspend call.
We have no other motions, questions or discussion. Motion, Mr. Engel?
Second.
Second, Mr. Corbett?
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Wexler?
Yes.
And Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
And motion to adopt, Mr. Mast. Do we have a second?
Second.
Second, Mr. Engel?
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Wexler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
And Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
And lastly, this ordinance is also adopted. Right. Now, we do have an executive session this evening, but before we go to executive session and before next time we gather and the public is allowed to appear, does any member of council have any letters that you are requested to read as part of citizens' concerns? Right? No? I have one. It is from Fred Gruber from 610 Corwin Street. It says, to members of City Council regarding the expansion of the Dora District. First, let me say that I am appalled that so many of you, plus the mayor and the director of the DDVB, seem to believe that the revitalization of downtown Defiance needs to be tied to drinking. That assertion alone should make you step back and reflect upon what you believe you are accomplishing. Is it to make downtown Defiance a little Bavaria, a drinking destination for Northwest Ohio? Bring us your thirsty and let us refresh you. What a great slogan for our city and replacement of a great place to live. As to assisting the food trucks at the viaduct, I find it difficult to believe that someone is going to buy a beer at Spanky's and then walk 9 blocks to D-Town to find something to eat with it, or that they would walk to Kingsbury Park to fry some chicken to have with it. What about focusing some thought on making the center of downtown more accessible to the population? Return the 2 lanes of traffic and angled parking from 2nd through 5th Streets. Bring the food trucks into 3rd and 4th Streets on Friday through Saturday afternoons. Allow restaurants to use several parking spaces in front of their buildings to extend outdoor seating for their patrons. Light up Clinton Street to rival Chicago's Michigan Avenue year-round. Give tax breaks to new downtown businesses. Assist with small business loans to help get them up and running. Promote activities which would bring folks as participants and supporters. Our relatively flat terrain and streets would serve well for cycling and running events. The ball fields at Defiance High School, Defiance College, and our city parks could be great resources for weekend tournaments. Construct a performance shell in Pontiac Park for concerts and theater productions. Find grant monies to reclaim the banks of the Maumee, which have eroded so badly, and construct a walkway or bicycle path for our community use along the beautiful resource. I urge you to become more contemplative in your planning for Defiance, perhaps inviting citizens to bring forth ideas to consider before you simply expose these thoughts in news articles and at council meetings, especially to more strongly consider the consequences of the actions you take as the leaders of our community. Signed, Fred Gruber, 610 Corwin Street, Defiance.
Let me just tell council that I did take Mr. Gruber up on his offer to invite him in and discuss his letter and anything else he cared to discuss, and he declined my offer. So we did follow up with the letter.
Okay. Well, thank you. And with that, if there are no other letters or citizens' concerns, we can stretch our legs for a few minutes and then we'll enter executive session.